Hello, and welcome to another episode of David's Divergent Discussions. I'm your host, David Gray Hammond, and today we are here with Daddy from the punk rock Autistic. So, Daddy, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit, and we'll go from there.
Sure. My name is Dani, as David has said. I've been kind of in the advocacy and activist scene for uh, disabilities and neurodivergency and social justice now for about 2 years online. But I myself am autistic, ADHD, and was diagnosed at 27. I'm 35 now, so it's been several years. But Uh, later diagnosis kind of came from my past 15, 16 years of working with the developmentally, intellectually disabled community directly. So kind of went full circle there. But yeah, that's essentially it. I'm on Facebook and a couple other places, and I also work as a neurodiversity consultant where I work with families, individuals, and businesses on training and educating and on what it means to be autistic and neurodivergent. So yeah.
Fantastic. Well, for anyone who's watching who doesn't know me, but I should imagine most of you do, I am autistic, ADHD, schizophrenic. I'm an author, activist. I do a lot of things.
Jack of all trades.
Uh, I work as a mentor. I do consultancy work. But today, as with all episodes of David's Divergent Discussions, we're here to talk about all things neurodivergent identity culture. We get into the philosophies behind it. I think it'll be really interesting because I think you've got some philosophies and understandings that perhaps some of my other guests have yet to espouse.
Mhm.
So I'm quite interested to really get into it with you. I would like to apologize to people who were waiting patiently at 5 p.m. for this to start. We are using a new live streaming platform, and there were some major technical difficulties that were very easily solved, but it took 45 minutes to do so. Um,
Mhm.
we were both quite stressed, so we took a minute to center ourselves. So if you're watching or listening live, I apologize for the late start. So, uh, Danny, I know
Mhm.
what being neurodivergent means for me as an autistic ADHD schizophrenic person. I'm really interested to hear what what is being neurodivergent to you? What does that word mean for you?
That's a great question. Anything that falls outside of the established norm, any difference, variation of the brain, physical, mental, developmental, intellectual disability. It's really neurodivergent is an umbrella term that essentially covers everything to create a sort of solidarity and intersectional approach of viewing disabilities and mental illnesses and et cetera, as something normal, something that is a from a humanistic lens that is not something to be uh, viewed as a negative aspect, but a normal part of like human variation. Um, I think for me, when I use the word neurodivergent, neurodiversity, there's a lot of misconception that many people kind of have taken as it being just autistic when it's an umbrella term that has everything schizophrenia, it's a bipolar to personality disorders to cerebral palsy, everything falls underneath that umbrella. And yeah, I've actually heard arguments lately saying that like it kind of covers everybody in some degree, right? And
Yeah.
it's giving more of a it's the antithesis to othering, right? That we have in our society. That anybody with any sort of like difference is other, is a problem, is something that needs to be corrected or fixed. And then instead, just looking at it like, oh no, this is just how humanity looks. So yeah, that's my long kind of long answer to that.
Yeah, that was a really good answer.
Mhm.
And yeah, I definitely agree with neurodiversity sort of encompassing literally everyone because,
Mhm.
okay, we have these sort of essentialist boxes of neurotypical, autistic,
Mhm.
ADHD, schizophrenic, bipolar. But thinking more broadly and outside of that very essentialist approach that, you're born one way or the other, everyone's brain is unique. Like
Mhm.
everyone's body mind has its own idiosyncrasies, has its own wiring.
Yeah.
We all have a unique experience and relationship with the world and our body mind. And I use the word body mind, since reading Nick Walker's work, and
Mhm.
she very much, highlighted to me the fact that when we think about our mind, it's more than just what's in our head. It's our entire nervous system which runs through our entire body.
Absolutely.
So we experience the world with our entire self, not just our brains. Our brains process it, but it's our entire body that is experiencing the world. And so, because everyone's experience is unique, everyone's processing of that world is unique, whilst we
Mhm.
have those shared experiences, I think personally, I sort of see we have the shared subjective experiences that constitute the identities, like being autistic, ADHD, neurotypical. But from a neurodiversity perspective, it's important to consider just how individual every single person
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think there's also people will use the word neurodivergent, neurodiverse interchangeably when they are
Yeah,
very different words.
yeah,
Whereas like neurodiverse is just everybody, right? Neurodiversity covers everybody, no matter who you are. Neurodivergent and neurotypical then would be the distinction between. But then even like I guess it's really like the further we look into people, the more diversity we see within everybody. And it kind of becomes an interesting term that can be defined dependent on I guess the person's own experiences, right? Like for if you were to, take my experiences and then compare and contrast it to somebody who has um little to no little a much lower degree of challenges with navigating through the environment that for me would be much more challenging. They may be viewed or view themselves then as like less neurodivergent or more neurodivergent depending on the way you are, but that I think kind of opens the door to um like you said, like identity issues and it would just then circle back into, what we've had an issue, our community have had an issue for a while of like using concepts like functioning labels to distinguish people. Neurodiversity is supposed to be the antithesis to that. It's supposed to be this like view of that like it's not less or more, it's just different. And it's a different and it's subjective and it's relative to each individual. I think it kind of really really brings back the humanity to disabilities a lot,
yeah,
and differences
yeah.
between people.
And I think that that's really important, isn't it? Because society as a whole has had a tendency to dehumanize neurodivergent people.
Mhm.
When you look at how we're represented in the media, in the news,
Mhm.
when you consider the stories that come out, whenever there's some kind of mass tragedy, the perpetrator, there's always talk of, well, they were mentally ill, they were autistic, they were, in some way, there is this othering in that people who do bad things, their brains are different, they're not quite as human as we are,
Yeah,
and that leads into these ideas that you know people identify as neurotypical, but really there's no such thing as neurotypical. What
exactly.
exists is cultural normativity, and there are those that can perform that normativity relatively easily,
Yeah.
and then there are vastly more people, I believe, that find normativity very difficult to perform. And, when you consider just how many people probably find normative values difficult to stick to, um, it makes me wonder if neurodivergent people really are a cultural minority or whether we've been positioned as a cultural minority because it is politically beneficial for people in charge.
I that's a really good point. I've been thinking about that it's the people that I meet that identify as like normal, as neurotypical. If you start to unravel that a little bit and have them start like having some sort of self introspective kind of analysis of like what does that normalcy look like for them, it starts to kind of fall apart. That there's always just something within somebody that is different. But with the living here in the US, we have a lot of violent tragedies take place on a daily basis. And there there's always on the media some sort of like scapegoat of like why this person did it. And it's always looking at like, oh, well, they were, neurodivergent, or they were autistic, or they were mentally ill, or then that's focusing on blaming the variation of that person's experiences instead of looking at like what was the cultural, socioeconomic, and like so like the social and socioeconomic like issues that like led to that occurring, right? Like, was it poverty? Was it racial discrimination? Was it it could go on and on of anything that could lead those things to occurring. But it always is like, well, the easiest thing is rather than changing what's causing this problem, let's just blame it on the person who's different. Yeah, I think neurodiversity is the not the cure, but is a fight against that.
Yeah, yeah. I think because this is where the neurodiversity movement differs from the neurodiversity paradigm, is that you've got
Mm-hmm.
the neurodiversity paradigm, which positions uh, difference as a part of biodiversity, which obviously is essential to the survival of a species. But the
Mm-hmm.
neurodiversity movement, in its own right, is more of it's activism. It's a
Mm-hmm.
civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fight back against the world that others us, and it sometimes does it in increasingly violent ways.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, uh, when you trace back the othering of neurodivergent people, you come back to these core normative values, which arose very much from, I would argue, white colonial Europe. um,
100%.
you know,
100%.
and it's spread throughout the world, and as that colonial system spread throughout the world and proliferated, we see a rise in these normative values. And they're very much values, I believe, that are designed to serve, like, well, to begin with, a feudalist mindset, that you serve king and country. But then, we've moved over into that neoliberalist mind, self reliant and, you know, productive and pay our taxes and produce profit, very much under that capitalist system.
Yeah.
And so if you can't serve that capitalist system in the way that the system wants you to, you are othered. You are
Disposable.
mistreated. Yeah, you become disposable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it raises something I haven't really discussed on these podcasts yet, but I think is very relevant to the talk of colonialism. Is we have a great deal of variation and diversity in spirituality amongst
Yeah.
neurodivergent communities.
Yeah.
I mean, personally, I was raised by a mother who was an Anglo-Catholic priest. Um, I was raised in the Christian tradition, but for me, I guess part of my neuroqueering has been to though step away from that tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, my spirituality has become somewhat of a mix of different things that I've adopted from various places. And,
Mm-hmm.
I've sort of built my own understanding of what spirituality is, based on the different environments I've been in.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if you might talk a little bit about your own spirituality and how it relates to your neurodivergent identity.
Totally. It might take me a couple minutes to get there, but I will do my
Yeah.
best to keep it like as non-tangent as possible.
I'll go on tangents.
Okay.
That's fine. It's divergent discussion.
Okay. Well,
Tangents.
if it's taking me too long to get to the point, just you feel free to redirect me back on the thing at hand. So uh, for me, I was raised in a my family immigrated to the United States from Sweden, and when they came here from Sweden, a lot of my family were part of majority of my family was part of what's called the Swedish Covenant Church, which is a very very small denomination that is like based out of originally from like Swedish Lutheran, but over time kind of became its own sort of philosophy and denomination. And when my grandparents came here to the United States, both sides of my family were engaged in the church very heavily. My grandfather was a pastor for 40, 50 years. My both of my parents growing up were very like the church was like that was our community, and that was like part of our family's identity was that. And thankfully, a lot of that church in particular was definitely has some work to do, but is definitely a little bit more liberal and progressive than other churches in the United States. But for me, it wasn't really like their politics or their policies that like at my young age that I had an issue with. It was for me, it was that I've always been one of those people who have like had a lot of questions. I've been a like I guess what you would call like, some people use the term like seeker or something, right? Like I knew that like the story not like from both the church but also through like the secular um this lack of curiosity of like trying to like peel back the layers of like not really just having like an answer provided to you. That never really was my concern. I wanted to have like an experiential answer. I wanted to be able to, and that could be from the nature of reality to the nature of self to the foundation of and building blocks and like the laws of the universe itself. I've always been very science minded. Like when in Bible like school, I was more interested. I used to sneak in a copy of Carl Sagan's books with me like in the church all the time because I was like more interested in reading that than I was in hearing these stories. And from a young age, I would always ask like my pastors, my youth group leaders, like, "Oh, why is it like this way? Why? Like, why was the question I always had?" And no one could ever give me like a sustainable or an answer that really kind of quenched it for me. And as I got older, I started to read and learn more, and I eventually like because none of this set right with me, I never really considered myself a theistic person. I never really considered myself like a Christian, right? And to the dismay of my family, they were not very happy about that. But they've come around over the past like 20 years. But through that deconditioning, I try to educate myself as much as I could on different, philosophies, be it Western or Eastern or from other cultures, other religions, other spiritualities. And for me, um, I had always been on like this path of trying to learn more and like go to the next level of like, well, what can I learn from here? What can I learn from here? Uh, and about 15 years ago, it was really I came across Buddhism, and that's like what really stuck with me as a core kind of thing that I aligned with. And I've been practicing now Buddhism for 16 years, and pretty intensely for the past 10 or 12. Originally through the Tibetan system, and now through the Japanese tradition of Soto Zen is kind of like my lineage now. But with like the neurodiversity part of that is that for me, I was never really concerned with like someone's belief. I was never really concerned with belief because belief didn't give answers. Belief was the idea of faith, right? That we needed to basically convince ourselves and cast away doubts in order to like find salvation, right? Like to have these ideas that can't be experienced directly. So we need to have faith that they're real, that we can't interact with what my church and religion growing up called God. We can't directly interact with it, but we can feel the Holy Spirit and or whatnot. And to me, that was always like that's a lot of conditioning and a lot of faith, a lot of convincing oneself. And I'm not knocking anybody who believes that. It wasn't for me. And through the paths that I found, it wasn't about the answer always on a scholastic level. Like there's a lot of that learning, but it was more about grabbing and grasping something through direct first-hand experience. And I think through my own meditation practice, my own experiences with that, and even like with my experiences with like say like psychedelics, it's been more of a the like looking at the subtlety of reality and our experience interacting with it and having a direct experience rather than faith to me was so much more powerful. And I think for me that comes with being autistic as well, is that even when it came to like school, it was like I wanted to understand why I wanted to know the mechanics of things. I want to know why does it work this way and why do we get to that answer. And often it was just like, here's an answer, just accept it. And I'm like, I can't do that. Like I need to know, I need to come to that answer on my own rather than having someone tell me that. um and that's been kind of the fuel to the fire of my own spirituality, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's really important to sort of make the distinction between religion and spirituality, isn't it? Because religion is sort of like a conditioning system in my mind. It's an institution that
Mm-hmm.
tells you how you should think and feel about certain things. Spirituality, on the other hand, for me, and I guess from what you said for you, is more about experience. It's about exploration of perhaps higher truths that people don't necessarily think about day to day.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned psychedelics in that because obviously I have my own experience with psychedelics. I
Mm-hmm.
always try to keep them separate from the discussion I have around addiction because my experience with psychedelics was very different to my experience with drugs that I was addicted to.
Of course,
For me,
100%.
psychedelics, I mean, obviously the word literally means mind manifesting.
Yeah.
But for me it was about simultaneously being introspective and exploring the outside at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it showed me that there was a spiritual part of me that could understand the wider world by understanding what was within myself because I am part of that wider world. And not,
There's no difference between the two. We're just an
yeah,
aperture of experience, like subjective, right? So a
yeah,
subjective aperture of the greater whole. Um, it's funny that your distinction of religion and spirituality is. I think before I go like more into the psychedelic, I wanted to bring this point up before I forget because I will forget. But this is actually something that I've was talking about online earlier, is that this idea of like this word like religion, right, is such a Western uh, concept, right? That when we think of like when you and I and people in our experiences in our world in our culture, when we think of the word religion, we think of, generally we think of Christianity, we think of Judaism, and we think of like Islam, right?
yeah,
The three big Western religions. And I, from somebody who's been practicing Buddhism for so long, and it's funny when I hear people say, I'm not saying this is what you're saying, but I get this a lot. It's like, oh, Buddhism's not a religion; it's a spirituality, and it's like it's a religion, but it's not a religion on the same definition as like what a Western religion would be
yeah,
prescribed to, right? It's like when colonialists and imperialists came to Asian countries and they just got they interacted what we would call Buddhism, they prescribed that name to them. You're like, you're Buddhists, and they're like, what do you mean we're Buddhists? And for me, what I would use for the term religion is something that I would say is separate from culture, right? And the
yeah,
way that we have religion in the West, not internationally, But like if we were to look at like say an indigenous nation here in the United States, like the Hopi, right? This is just the first example that comes to my head. What we would view as like as the Hopis religion to them would be just their culture, it's their identity, it's who they are as a people. It's inseparable from their experiences and how they've charted out and like tried to understand the world around them. Whereas in the West, it's that's been stripped away from us. If you look like definitely in like pre-Christian Europe with like what we would call pagan, heathen, whatever you want to name it, that wasn't what we would call religion. It was their, it was who they were, it was their culture, it was their identity and their system of understanding the world. And I think I find it funny that that term essentially doesn't, it almost doesn't mean anything, because when we look at Christianity, a lot of Christianity is through history has stripped that identity and culture and connection to the world from a population, and then distilled this like Puritan, sterile system that breeds like serfdom and capitalism and colonialism and hegemony. Whereas you look at region, and I'm not saying they're like other regions in the world aren't free from this same criticism, but not nearly to the extent that like we've gotten here in the West. Um, it's funny how English is such a limited language, right? And it's so tainted by like our experiences. If that makes any sense.
It does, it does. And it really raises the point to me that, I think one of the reasons that neurodivergent people perhaps struggle with organized religion in the
Mhm.
West, at least,
Mhm.
is because we have this very strong sense of justice. So many of us
Yeah,
want the world to be fair. And organized religion in the West has become a tool of structural oppression.
100%.
Like, you know, when you look back at the history of Christianity, like people don't understand that, I see a lot of Christians going, oh, we've got to be peaceful. I'm not going to listen if you shout. I'm like, you do understand that the God you worship was literally in temples, flipping tables and violently resisting. But the
He was an anarchist. Like
institution,
he had no patience for
yeah,
any of
the
that.
institution that has arisen that we call Christianity has gone in a completely different direction, and it has become controlling the population, and
Yeah,
bringing them into line with, once again, those normative ideas of how we should conduct ourselves as a civilized society. And I think that's perhaps where neurodivergent people disconnect from religion, is because when religion
yeah.
is removed from spiritual culture and becomes a tool of oppression,
It's no
we
longer religion at that point.
it's
It's
no
just
longer a
becomes
religion,
emotion.
is it?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah. No,
I
you're
think
right.
that's really significant to neurodivergent people, because
Yeah,
we, the neurodivergent people I have met, we want to create a fair world where people are equal and where people have access to what they need and where people can live their lives as long as they are not doing any harm.
it's funny how so many of us are leftists, then, right?
Yeah, yeah, there's definitely something to be said about the overrepresentation of leftist politics in the neurodivergent community. And that's not
Mhm.
me saying that leftist politics are without their failures.
No, of course not.
There's certainly groups within leftist groups that have some troubling
Yeah,
views. Uh, but overall,
but if
there's
we're going to compare and contrast, like from the entirety of like the spectrum of like of sociology and politics, like I would say the right wing tends to be more in line with
yeah, absolutely,
authoritarianism,
absolutely.
individualism, and fascism, whereas the left is more about solidarity, socialist ideas of creating a world without border, without like sovereignty, without the collective rather than the individual, because you can't have the individual without the collective. And I think honestly that is the same thing that turns in with a lot of like what you said with spirituality, is that it's the sense of justice and the sense of like right and wrong. It's the sense of like I morality is such a weird thing because I think it is completely subjective and relative, but I think that there's evolutionary factors that exist in that are inherent in all of us that are not there because of like a good person or a bad person, because those are you know that's completely relative to the individual and what they define as that, but factors that like ensure our survival as a species, that feeds into like what an idea of ethics are and morals are. And I think that, autistic people tend to see those things a little bit more loudly than I would say non-autistic people do, because um, we aren't as prone to being indoctrinated into the like social conditioning of and social constructs that most people are. I think,
Yeah,
especially
and
younger.
I think a lot of those moral judgments and things, they're kind of upheld by the way we conduct investigation in the Western world. So when we look at any particular group, take a minority group, for example, autistic people,
Mhm.
or people of color, or uh, LGBT plus
Mhm.
communities, there are moral judgments placed. And I think it's because, especially in the West, the way social sciences seem to be conducted by a lot of people is, firstly, they're not part of the group that they're investigating.
Mhm.
They tend to take this positivist attitude that there is some sort of objective truth awaiting discovery.
Mhm.
And therefore, they use these standardized measures that take no account of their own biases or privileges. And you have this detachment from, you have the observer and the subject. And so knowledge production in the West, it's, I'm trying to think of how to put it. There is this level of, we're observing from the outside, but our observations are true, even though they take no account of the lived experience.
100%. That's
You know,
so accurate.
and it's so frustrating because, personally, I don't take a positivist view of things. I'm more of an interpretivist.
Yeah.
I believe that there's less objective truth in the world, and things are far more subjective, because you know what I hold to be true is going to be entirely different to what someone else might hold to be true, because I have different cultural experiences,
Mhm.
different internal world. I have a different experience and relationship with the world to any other person. So the way I interpret things is going to be entirely different. And I think this is something that the neurodivergent community recognizes far more, with its push to have research into neurodivergent people conducted by neurodivergent people.
Yes.
You know, we recognize that lived experience, for years, involving lived experience has been seen as like this anti-science, antithetical to what science is. But actually, I think when you're conducting science about a group of people, you have to have lived experience.
Absolutely. Uh, this was something that I really enjoyed, it, kind of navigating through in my undergrad. A lot of the studies and research papers and stuff that I did in university was on this like very idea that like our our lived experiences doesn't have to be antithetical to science, but it can reinforce and reevaluate the way that we look at science, right? Where if we're, especially from like the social sciences, right, and then like the perspective of like sociology, right, is
Yeah,
is that to be like intersectional and to be um to look at the hegemonic powers in the world. We can't The experience that like I have as a white person is going to look very different than it would be for somebody who is marginalized and more disenfranchised than I am. And this is actually something that I've even noticed a lot within the autistic community specifically, is that it tends to reinforce, as much as like people want to fight against this, is that it continued to reinforce the subjective versus objective kind of idea of like that this bias is that autism is like this white male centric um experience, and by that very factor our voices tend to outshine and overspeak and take the platform away from the experience, and speak for the experiences of all autistic people, whereas the experiences of somebody who's say a black trans woman is going to look incredibly different than it is for me, right?
Yeah.
because their cultural, societal, economic, um, spiritual like experiences are going to be vastly different. So that paradigm and that labeling doesn't fit for everyone. And it has to look at the person's direct firsthand experience in order to be an objective and larger experience to encompass everybody. And I think that is kind of a missing point from even the people who are clamoring that same sort of like phrasing, right? Is that I know that I'm guilty of it. We all are, right? Because we exist in a bubble of our own, like, experiences that are benefited by white supremacy and capitalism.
Yeah, but this really raises the point that marginalized groups, neurodivergent people,
Mm-hmm.
um, we thrive best when we are immersed in lived experience,
Mm-hmm.
trading knowledge with other people who have similar experiences to us. And this has been supported in research. I'm thinking specifically of the work of Dr. Monique Botha, who
Mm-hmm.
showed that if you look at things through the model of minority stress, so the various things that accumulate as being part of a minority group to create stress for that group, that minority stress is reduced when they have access to community with
Yeah.
their peers, with people who have similar lived experiences. And I think it's important to note similar, not exactly the same,
Yeah.
because autistic people are a diverse group, ADHD people are a diverse group, Black people are a diverse group. People have
Totally.
a tendency when they talk about marginalized identities to assume that everyone in that group is a facsimile of everyone else. And
Right. Yeah. Like it's all monolithic in a non-monolithic group, right? That it doesn't. You're right. It doesn't add up if we look at it that way.
yeah, and it's sort of another way that we're dehumanized, isn't it? Because when people when neurotypical people think about other neurotypical people, they don't go, "Oh, well, we're all like each other. We're all exactly the same. We all have the same experiences."
Mm-hmm.
They understand there is diversity in their own peer group. But
Mm-hmm.
when they start talking about minority groups, people outside of those minority groups have this tendency to paint with a broad brush and just assume that everyone has the same experiences. And
Oh, totally.
that's just simply not true. And I think that's one of the most frustrating things, perhaps, about being neurodivergent. What something that happens to me a lot is if I tell someone in my home city that I'm autistic, they'll start listing other autistic people in my home city that they know and be like, "Oh, have you met this person?" I'm like, "Well, no, because we
Yeah.
we don't have like a communication system.
No.
I'm not like telepathically connected to
No, we're
everyone."
not the Borg. We're not like assimilated, we're like in a unimind, right? No, I get like and queer and people of color get the same sort of thing too. It's like,
Yeah,
oh, you're non-binary. Do you know my non-binary other friend? I'm like, how no? Why would no? We don't have like an interconnected telepathic way of like knowing every single person. Um,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, no,
And
you're
don't
right.
even get me started on my queer identity because I tell someone I'm queer and they're like, "But you seem so not queer," and I'm like, "That's not the compliment you think it is."
Right.
Like, like,
Yeah.
I use the word queer specifically because for me, my queerness is about more than who I'm sleeping with. It's about more than the gender I identify with. For me, and I think this will lead nicely into neuroqueerness. Queerness for me is about subverting expectation. So actually, if I am not like the stereotype you have in your head for what a queer person or a neurodivergent person should
Mhm.
be, I'm doing something right because I am trying to not be what's expected.
Um, yeah, I have even stopped using specific nomenclature for myself.
Yeah.
Like I would say neuroqueer, queer is like, and that's pretty much as far as I would go. And if people need to know specifics, I would answer it. And they're like, oh, well, then you're this. I'm like, well, no, because that terminology itself is creating a sense of identity that's placed on me that I have to adhere to. So I used to say that I was asexual and non-binary, but there's so many. distinguishing factors and things that exist within those separate things that are umbrellas in themselves, right? They're a spectrum in itself. And for me, my personal experience with gender and sexuality is inseparable from the fact that I have an autistic brain.
Yeah.
They're one and the same. My
Yeah.
experience of how I view myself and my gender is that gender is a social construct, and it has played a role into forming who I am, and this illusion of like this self, right? This concept of Dani is it doesn't exist. I'm not real. I we can go into the philosophy of that whatever, but the I of like who I am, right, is an amalgamation of all of the experiences that I've had that have built up into this, creating this sense of an independent self. And all of my experience with gender and sexuality, those are also societal formed. And I think that my autistic brain allows me to see what's a social construct and what is actually like an
Yeah.
objective experience. And
Yeah.
for me, neither of them really are real. So I don't really need to use a term for it. So like you had mentioned, neuroqueer and queer is just kind of that's as far as I need to go for like
Yeah.
identity specifics language.
And this is something I talk about a lot in my writing is,
Mhm.
the changeability of identity. Like who I am, me, myself, the self, is entirely socially constructed. I
Mhm.
have no independent notions of who I am that don't come from knowledge and experience I acquired from the wider environment.
Mhm.
Like everything that I use to understand myself and who I am came from someone else.
Mhm.
So in that sense, every aspect of me is entirely socially constructed. And with that in mind, I'm always thinking about the fact that a lot of people have this idea that the various identities we apply to ourselves are fixed. So I know some people had a bit of whiplash because I used to tell people I'm asexual, but now I'll tell people, actually, I think I'm pansexual. What happened was I had new experiences in the wider
Mhm.
environment and my sense of self changed.
Yep.
And this is where it comes down to that idea that I've written about in my books, the chaotic self, this ever changing sense of self. You know, you can queer who you are, you can queer your body, mind, and yourself, but you change constantly and you don't unchange. You don't ping back to where you were and start all
Mm-mm.
over again. We are, as humans, creatures that go through constant change and form and reform and build and structure and restructure.
Pretty Buddhist, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
That's pretty Buddhist.
We are not a fixed point.
Yeah.
Like, and I think for me, that's what, if anyone asks me what being neurodivergent means to me, that's really what it means to me. Because my view of that is inseparable from my autistic brain because I
Mhm.
can only think autistically. I can only
Mhm.
think neurodivergently.
Mhm.
So the fact that I view myself as an untethered entity that kind of takes whatever shape the environment gives it at the time, that is
Mhm.
intrinsically linked to who I am as a neurodivergent person.
Mhm. I couldn't have said it better myself. It's nothing. Nothing has an inanimate or not, sentient or not. All experiences in life and the universe as a whole, none of it has an independent, like infinite, an independent infinite self, right? Everything is a connection of interdependence and or interdependent origination of something else that preceded it. Everything is subject to a giant chain, and everything is interconnected, right? So everything is a mirror of itself too. So regardless of like of how much our grasping wants to have something be a fixed, infinite point that is independently existing. That's fighting against nature. It doesn't work that way. So why should our identities and our experiences be like also be forced to exist in that as well? When that's fighting against nature. It's funny that you mentioned that you went from asexual to pansexual, where I went from pansexual to asexual,
Okay.
to just being like, I'm nothing. I'm I'm
Yeah.
not, there's not, I can't be defined by like a term that's been placed on me, because like my our experiences as life can't be defined, right? Like it's this whole idea that we have to have all of this like specific terminology and identity attached to terminology is such a a, a capitalist Christian kind of idea, right? That even the very way that we go about like giving validity to experience of reality is by naming objects, right?
Yeah.
And that the very act of putting a label on an object creates a distinction then between subject and object, when in reality there is no difference. That barrier between self and other doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's only by the placing of the forcing of it being now an object now creates that division, when reality doesn't work that way.
Yeah. And it kind of comes back to that point about sort of religion and spirituality, and it raises a point to me. As I said, I a lot of my views I've sort of had a
Mm-hmm.
bit of a pick and mix with
Mm-hmm.
everything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it makes me think, interestingly, about a part of the Bible where, they're talking about who Jesus is, and he says, I am who you say I am. And I find
Mm-hmm.
that really interesting because lots of people assume he's talking about, are you the king of the Jews? But to me, actually, it's always stuck with me as you can't exist outside of who people view you as. Because essentially, to be completely independent is to be nothing, because you would have to be devoid of all information from other people, which is
Mm-hmm.
the entire way that our experience works, is through things we learn from the environment. So to be
Mm-hmm.
independent of that construction is to be nothingness, which
And nothingness doesn't exist.
exactly. So,
Mm-hmm.
I that always sticks with me. I am who you say I am. And whilst I really don't identify particularly as a Christian, there's aspects that I think, they've stuck with me, and that's one of them. But it does interest me, the idea of nothingness, though, because certainly when I was going through years of addiction, um, because, being neurodivergent can be a nightmare when your
Mm-hmm.
needs are not being met. Um, I What I was really looking for was nothingness, like the
Mm-hmm.
absence of everything. I couldn't cope with anything. So what I was looking for,
What's the complete state of disassociation?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, like I wanted to be completely separate from existence.
yeah,
But interestingly, it was psychedelics that taught me just how connected to everything I am
yeah.
and the importance of that connection as well.
In in Buddhism, there's this term in Sanskrit. It's sunyata, and in English, that roughly translates to emptiness. And emptiness and nothingness are not the same thing.
Yeah,
And it's I've had this concept of emptiness and not nothingness is a non-duality kind of approach of viewing, kind of what I used that term before, like interdependent origination, is that like all forms of matter and action in life, be it us, be it just the cosmos itself, is born of something else, right? There's this arising that everything's interconnected, and psychedelics definitely kind of give that same sort of like viewing that emptiness, like like non-self arising independent origination factor, allows you to see that a lot more
yeah,
than sober sense of mind. And it's funny because like this idea of emptiness is something that like they speak a lot about, in they use different language for it, but they're explaining the similar or the same concept in things like physics and quantum mechanics, and even people who have experiences with psychedelics talk about the same thing. People from other cultures, say the Buddhists, or those who are part of Vedanta, or you know pre-Hinduism, like pre-Brahmanism, like Hindu, like kind of things from like that sort of dharmic kind of idea, is that exact same approach. And our trauma and our suffering is what is pushing us away from like seeing reality as it is, and rejecting reality, and then trying to fleet into a state of non-existence to be like not affected by the world around us. So when you talk about addiction, and those who I know who've struggled with addiction, family members, and even my own clients, is something that they talk about a lot, is this need of wanting connection to emptiness, but instead falling into a cycle of needing nothingness because everything is just too much to handle.
Yeah, yeah, and I always talked about, you know, I used to keep these detailed journals of what I'd taken, how much I'd taken, what
Mm-hmm.
combinations, how it
Mm-hmm.
affected me over time. I treated myself like a science experiment.
I've
I
done the same
remember,
thing.
I
Exact
remember
same thing.
once my key worker at the Drug and Alcohol Service said, "What is the actual goal of this experiment?" And I just said, "Oblivion."
Hmm.
Like, I could not. There was no better word for it than that. Really, that was my goal. But I think you're right. I think maybe what I've always needed is emptiness rather than nothingness.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that ability to lift the trauma out and have space for myself.
Exists in equanimity, like pure equanimity, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And from my perspective of that, of like needing emptiness, it doesn't mean it's devoid of anything. It captures everything because everything comes from that, right?
yeah,
Is to be the to reconnect to the sense of like source of all things, and that equanimity, I think, in my mind, in my experiences, is like the most complete form of compassion. And it's not, and that compassion is like for our own trauma, and the only way that we can ever heal from trauma is having compassion for ourselves, right? Is to like
yeah,
view the problem and not steer away from it. Is to face it directly. Like that's the whole goal of like a lot of therapy, right? Psychotherapy is to uncover what is the source that's causing these like issues in someone's life, and to not run away from them, but to like sit with it and to be completely present in that, and in a non-attached kind of way, but like as an objective observation, and that is based on love for our own self and for our own struggles. um, do you find that like your experiences with psychedelics made that a little bit easier for you to kind of navigate that space?
my experiences of psychedelics are an interesting one because I won't lie, some of the experiences were almost traumatic in their own right, but different to what you typically view as trauma. You know,
Mm-hmm.
there were terrifying experiences, there were joy-filled experiences,
Mm-hmm.
there were experiences, most of them, in fact, which I cannot put into language.
Yeah,
Um,
ineffable.
yeah, you know, I always try and explain. A lot of people actually have asked me about my experiences with DMT, and there is no good way of explaining those experiences to people.
So Bruce Lee used to use this like, and this is actually like an old Zen Buddhist term, but it's the finger pointing at the moon. Is that to describe it is to then, like I said before, is to put labeling and creating an experience that is ineffable into words. Now somebody else who's interpreting that is going to, their mind is going to visualize something. It's going to put meaning onto it that isn't the experience. It's a simulation of that experience. And the like the finger pointing at the moon is that like the teaching, the wisdom of an experience is the moon, but we're someone is pointing at it, we're not paying attention to the moon, we're paying attention to the finger, and we're missing out on all of that, the glorious experience that can come with that. So with
Yeah,
like exactly with my experiences with not even just psychedelics, but like some of my experiences with meditation, like I can't put into words what that experience is like, because it's no longer me that was experiencing that DMT trip. It was the observer. It was consciousness itself beyond self, right? It was just pure awareness. I've always told people that my experiences with dimethyltryptamine was the experiences of death, and
Yeah.
that death wasn't fear; it was liberation in its purest form. It
Yeah.
was it was a reconnection to the source and the ground, the primordial ground of all things.
Yeah.
And I can't put that in words. It's as far as I can go with it. I could, we can talk about, pretty colors and fractals and geometric shapes and, weird entities that exist and play pranks on us in that space. But it's like none of that is like that. None of that does that. The words
That's
don't do it
that's the very surface of it. Like,
very surface. Yeah.
there's no good way to describe the complete dissolution of the self. Like, you know,
And I think going back to religion, a lot of religions have tried, and people will give a teaching on like, hey, what you think is real is not, and you are in fact the entirety of the cosmos experiencing itself subjectively as an aperture temporarily, and you're not real. People will then create a religion out of that, right?
yeah,
Like in a lot of the Gnostic texts in the Bible, the language that Christ used was very different from post Council of Nicaea New Testament Jesus.
yeah,
He wasn't saying that I am the temple of God. He's saying, that God himself is you, that you are not the creator deity. You're not like it's not monistic. It's just that experience that everybody has an eye, right? That awareness itself is everything. And yeah, to dissolve the delusion of being separate from everything is, you can't really write that down on paper. But
we are the universe acknowledging itself, essentially.
yeah,
Um,
Carl Sagan said essentially the same thing, that we were just a way for the universe to know itself subjectively for a short period of time. I'm
yeah.
paraphrasing, but
Or
essentially
to
that's
put
what.
it another way, when dust explodes hard enough, it wakes up and thinks about itself.
I like that. I like
Yeah.
that. I like that a lot. Oh man, yeah, no, that's a really good analogy. It's
Yeah, I will level. I saw that somewhere on Facebook. It was like one of those meme things,
yeah,
but it didn't have any creator credited. It was just like text, and it said, "When dust explodes hard enough, it wakes up and thinks about itself," and that stuck with me.
that. Are you familiar with the term koan? Like what a koan is? Or have you heard this term before?
I haven't heard that term.
Okay, so Zen Buddhism, like specifically in Zen, is part of Mahayana, right? And that's like one of the three main vehicles of Buddhism. But specifically in Zen, um, there's this idea in Rinzai is a particular like lineage of Japanese Zen, and some Soto schools use this, but it's primarily in Rinzai. They use this idea, this training, right, and this mind training. That is called a koan, and it's essentially breaking the rational and logical thinking and analysis of the mind, and inverting someone's awareness and thought in on itself. And a lot of them are very paradoxical questions that are kind of like asked from the teacher to the student, of like, one that's really well known that I think is lost kind of its importance just through pop culture, or just language itself, is like, if a tree falls in a forest and no one is there to hear it, doesn't make a sound, right? Or like, what is the sound of one-handed clapping? Is that there's really not a logical, rational answer for that, but an experiential kind of observation and sharing of something. And that question in itself that you about dust is really a koan, is that like something that is ultimate truth, right? Ultimate reality, ultimate experience of like not like our conventional navigation of the world around us, but like the ultimate, like what it actually is. We can't explain in words. So in order for to direct someone's mind into seeing that, we have to kind of invert that experience, to kind of break it a little bit, kind of f up the brain a little bit, to make you like kind of see it like they call it true pointing, right? Like the true pointing at things. And yeah, that dust analogy fits perfectly with that usage of like what a koan would be. that would be like the answer, I think, to something rather than like a question. But
Yeah,
yeah, I
absolutely.
love paradoxical questions like that don't really have an answer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It always makes me think of there was a Greek philosopher called Zeno who
Mhm.
did a bunch of different paradoxes, and one of my favorites was the dichotomy paradox.
Mhm.
The idea is, you're traveling from point A to B, so you get to halfway, but then you have to get to halfway again, and you can keep halving infinitely and never actually arriving at your destination. So, how does one arrive at your destination if you're forever traveling to the halfway point?
Exactly. That also kind of reminds me of what the ship, the one philosophical exercise of like, if you slowly replace one piece of a ship over and over and over again, at what point does that like ship that you're like, you take a piece and you build a new ship with it, right? You keep switching it out and switching it out. At one point does that new ship become a completely different like ship? Like, where's the source of its like original form? Does it still exist, or has it been completely replaced? It's kind of the same sort of,
Yeah,
brain
and I
exercise.
think this kind of all ties in quite neatly, bringing it back with neuroqueering. When we queer our neurology, we
Mm-hmm.
are at will altering our body minds. So
Mm-hmm.
it raises that question, at what point do we become at what point have we queered ourselves to the extent that we are no longer the same person? So, that's where I sort of came up with the thought of the chaotic self, that from any given moment to another moment, we're not entirely the same person between two moments because we are
Yeah.
constantly changing. We are constantly swapping out the parts of the ship.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny, like if I were to look back at like how I was as a child, or even just 10 years ago, shit, even yesterday, even 10 minutes ago, this idea of like who I am really only carries its weight in the present, right? Like the here and now. And I would argue it's really all that exists is the here and now. But like this queering of myself of like this idea of near queer for me doesn't need to go beyond like what I'm experiencing right this moment and like how I identify myself right now and in this moment. Because, you know, if I were to use other language and terminology that people have placed on me that now has a definition that is defined by other people and not how I define myself, I'm losing my autonomy, right? I'm losing my ability to be my own person, to be my own experience. And that term of neuroqueer, I think, fits with that really, really well. And you've talked about this in your writing, is that it's a fluid, malleable thing that because these experiences we have are not rigid and infinite, they are fluid and malleable. Um, but do you think that like with like neuroqueer, that is a term that could be used for anybody, regardless if they're queer or like neurodivergent? Like it could be something that like
So
is just
Nick Walker positions the idea of you are neuroqueer if you neuroqueer. So anyone who engages in neuroqueering is themselves neuroqueer. So a cisgendered heterosexual neurotypical performing person could intentionally neuroqueer themselves
Mhm.
into a different identity, and in that sense they are neuroqueer because they have
Mm.
neuroqueered their way out of normative values.
That is incredibly profound on a very spiritual and philosophical level, not just like a like an intersectional kind of sociological level, but like it's this whole idea that like we're not people, we're just peopling, like we're not
Yeah,
a self, we're just selfing like for a period of time, and that can look and change in various forms. So it's not like it's a what is it? It's a verb, right?
yeah.
It's an action. It's something that we're constantly doing.
Existence is. It's an action. It's not a state or a noun. It's not a description. Existence is what we're doing.
Tell me how I know that you've eaten mushrooms without saying I know that you've eaten mushrooms. That's so I like that a lot. That's great. It's funny. I can always tell when I have conversations with people who have like had, an experience that is completely dismantled their like preconceived idea of what things are. When I like, and that could be people who I know have like gone through like, like intense, 2 week total isolation meditation, like Vipassana retreats, or somebody who has taken a gratuitous amount of psilocybin. I'm like, you've peered into the void. You're kind of seeing things as like reconstructed. You're no longer seeing the entire Subway sandwich. You're seeing all of the different trays that have all of the different pieces kind of
Yeah.
building the sandwiches itself.
Yeah.
Like it's like the at Subway they call them what, like sandwich artists. Like it's kind of like, oh, you're a sandwich artist now. You see things as the pieces make the whole and the whole don't make the pieces.
Yeah.
Like,
And
so our queer experiences can be viewed in a very
an important part of my sandwich artist journey, which some people struggle to wrap their head around, is like being schizophrenic.
I was
Like,
just gonna ask, how does schizophrenic, like what is that? How would that make your experience different from somebody who isn't schizophrenic, such as myself? I'm glad that you brought that up because that was my next question for you.
I mean, I always describe myself to people as my brain is 1 foot out of reality at any given moment, but that's not actually true. It's like my brain is 1 foot further into reality
Mm-hmm.
than everybody else's. But the
Mm-hmm.
problem is that like when I become delusional, and I
Mm-hmm.
will say delusional, I've had psychotic delusions that,
Mm-hmm.
subjectively and objectively, whatever you want to call it, they
Well,
were
that's
not
kind of a
real.
defining need for like for diagnosing for schizophrenia, is
Yeah.
that right?
But when I've had delusions, it's shown me that reality is a subjective thing, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because even though everyone else was telling me that what was experienced by me was not real, it was still real to me. And it it sort of inadvertently queered my neurology with each episode by making me constantly look inward.
Mm-hmm.
Why am I having these thoughts? Why am I having these experiences? What is the point of origin for this?
Mm-hmm.
And when you combine that with psychedelic experiences, it brings this level of introspection that I can't put into words.
Yeah, I can't even fathom what the experience of being schizophrenic is like. But to add psychedelics into that just takes it to another level that like it can't I can't even wrap my head around what that would be like.
I didn't even know I was schizophrenic when I was using psychedelics. I
Mm-hmm.
knew something was off, let's say, um, but I guess the psychiatrist had an idea because they were prescribing me antipsychotics, not that I was taking them.
Yeah,
I do now because, I want to be sober and live a happy life.
totally.
And as much as I say that being schizophrenic has been transformative in an important way for me, I have suffered from being schizophrenic. The
Mm-hmm.
world is full of triggers. The world is not designed for schizophrenic people, probably more so than it's not designed for autistic people.
Absolutely
Uh,
more so.
so for me, I take medication as a tool to survive
Yeah.
in the world that I live in. But um, I will never say that I wish I wasn't schizophrenic because it's led me to the place I'm in now, and I'm
Well, even
quite
if you wish
at
you
peace
weren't,
with it.
there's nothing you can do to change that, right?
Yeah. I
It's
can't go back in time and unschizophrenic myself.
no.
It's just part of who I am. I wouldn't be David without it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to sit here and be like, "Oh, I wish I wasn't schizophrenic," because I can't. argue that, because by saying that, I'm wishing I wasn't me, and I'm quite at peace with who I am these days.
Was that? I'd imagine. I'm not. I don't even need to ask. I can imagine the challenge of that journey, of the acceptance of that, was took a really long time to get to peace with.
It has. It's been a very long journey, and it's really only been in the last year or two that I've come to peace with my schizophrenic identity.
Yeah.
Um, but as much as I say I'm 1 foot further into reality than other people, I have to recognize that, okay, I'm quite good at seeing different parts of the sandwich, but because I'm schizophrenic, my brain, when I become overwhelmed and stressed, will apply too much meaning to certain parts of the sandwich
Mm-hmm.
and come up with an entirely different sandwich.
Yeah.
You know, um, you know,
When you were in a having an episode of psychosis with your schizophrenia, are
yeah,
you aware that you're in psychosis?
no, not
Okay.
generally. I know some schizophrenic people do have an
Some are.
awareness, but for
Hmm.
me, once an episode is in full swing,
It's
reality,
indistinguishable from your
yeah,
baseline reality.
yeah.
Okay.
I can't in full swing. I can't tell the difference between the voices I'm hearing as a hallucination and the voices that people are talking to me with. The visual hallucinations I experience are as real as you are right now on my screen.
So, well, how would that interact, like, that distinction and that awareness of, like, of having these experiences, what, like, on from a psychedelic perspective? I know for me personally, like, when I'm in a psych, and I'm not comparing, psychedelics to
Yeah,
psychosis, but I definitely have been in a turbulent waters with the psychedelic experience that has definitely probably emulated some forms that people might experience in psychosis, right?
yeah.
Which is can be common for a lot of people. And I think a lot of that for me was more so before I was aware of set and setting. And I don't. You had mentioned this earlier, the distinction between like drugs and psychedelics, right? Like psychedelics can definitely be drugs for certain people, but like I don't. I've met people who would say that I'm sober, but I still use mushrooms on occasion as a medicine and as a tool,
Yeah,
right? So like there, I think it's a kind of its own separate class for when respected and used, like when proper set and setting, and is not as a way of escape, but as a way of navigating, one's own self and trauma.
yeah,
But there have definitely been experiences before I understood that when I was younger and not having proper set and setting protocol, that there were moments of what probably would have been more than just like a hallucination through being high on this drug, right? But for somebody who have this different experience of reality, when you throw, say, LSD or mushrooms on top of that, does that make does that intensify the experience, if of your schizophrenia?
So I'm trying to think of how to explain this. In a psychology, it's kind of like you're watching a TV screen, but there's a lot of static and you're quite separate from it, and
Mhm.
things feel very unreal. Whereas psychedelic experiences, for me, it's like a TV that's so high definition that I have stepped into the screen and can see every minute detail.
Yeah, or you're aware of your own experience. For me, it's almost like, when you're in a movie theater and you're watching a film and you get so absorbed into the film that you forget that you're watching the film, and then you have the moment where you realize, like, oh, I'm just watching a film. Psychedelics also do that for me sometimes, is like being able to decouple my awareness to
Yeah.
being objective of watching myself as if it was just a movie playing, right? Sorry to derail.
No,
Go
no,
ahead.
no. That's okay. No, I mean, one thing I will say is that it makes me laugh that in sort of like the 60s and 70s, they were encouraging psychology students to take psychedelics to understand schizophrenia. Because to me, psychedelics show you the connections that are there.
Mhm.
Psychosis is about the connections that are not there.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes a lot
Like,
of sense.
so yeah, like there are parallels, but they are also two wildly different experiences at the same time.
Totally.
They're,
Yeah.
they're, they're not binary by any extent. Like they are intertwined with each other. I should
Mhm.
imagine similar functions in the brain probably underlie both experiences,
Mhm.
but they are different experiences.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. I wasn't comparing the two. I think I'm trying. I guess I was asking if like when they if somebody who were in a situation where the two mixed of the psychosis episode and the psychedelic experience, I would imagine that that would probably make for a very challenging experience for
It would
somebody.
be an incredibly challenging experience, and I would never recommend it to
Yeah,
anyone
I wouldn't either.
because psychosis is on the whole, can be a very distressing experience. You don't want to go into a psychedelic experience in a state of distress.
Yeah, yeah. Set and setting is really important, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
You want to be in my opinion, in as peaceful a state entering a
yeah.
psychedelic
Oh yeah,
experience as
yeah, yeah.
possible.
For me, it's like cuddled up in bed with a good record on and like my phone off, and completely alone with the windows open and some sunlight and maybe a nice walk in the park, but
Yeah.
never by
Whereas,
my.
going into a psychedelic experience under the influence of psychosis would be more like standing on a busy freeway with static playing in your ears whilst people flash horrible lights in your eyes. You know, that's sort of the difference there is that the two. I don't believe the two should mix.
No,
Like
I don't.
they
No.
both they can both serve important purposes in people's lives,
Yeah.
but I don't believe they should come together because I think that's just
No,
I don't know.
I
Maybe in the future, as research evolves, we'll find ways that they can mix in a beneficial way.
I
But
would agree.
as it stands currently, I don't think we understand either experience well enough for them to be mixed together.
I
It'd
would
be like
very
taking
strong.
two unknown elements and throwing them in a jug together.
Yeah, you just have pure chaos.
Yeah,
I would very strongly agree with that. Even like, you know, folks I know who are like, "Hey, I want to try this," I really want to have this experience, and I would, depending on the individual, have told people like, I don't think you should. I don't think that you are in a space where you'd get a really good you'd get benefit out of it. It would damage, it would cause more harm than good.
I have
And that,
certainly met people where they've talked to me about it, and I've said, "You are not a person who would benefit from this."
yeah, it's funny. I have like a journal that I've kept like during those experiences, and um, it's yeah, I personally feel that I've never this idea of a bad trip. I've never really had one. Right? I've had really terrifying experiences on some of these substances, but ultimately that was a teaching experience. It wasn't the substance that gave me a terrifying experience. It was being faced with my own inner demons and trauma
Yeah,
that did right. It just allowed me to kind of pull into the subconscious and push things forward. It's like these are things that you need to address. These are things that you need to work on. And that to me is the benefit. But if someone is not in a place, mentally where they're able to navigate that, it could do permanent, irreversible harm. And I think it definitely needs to be very, very, very well respected and researched and knowledge. And you need to know what you're getting into before you jump
as
ship.
with any trauma therapy, you have
Totally.
to be prepared for the fact that things will feel worse before they feel better. And
Absolutely.
if a person is not prepared for the challenging part, then they are not ready to face that trauma. And one thing I have learned from psychedelics is that they will make you face that trauma.
Yeah, I agree completely. They'll this whole like when we were talking earlier, I think before we were on camera, we were talking about identity, right? And identity politics and identity like being such a strong attachment for a lot of people, especially within any form of like activism or advocacy. There's this attachment to identity, and that leads people often to um, leading by emotion and reactionary, like being reactionary rather than seeing things as they are.
Yeah.
Um, I definitely think psychedelics have helped me with that, but I think it's a good segue because I know there's a topic you wanted to cover. What are your like experiences? How would you how do you feel that like the nature of identity can be both a positive and a negative for activism, and can, because I think lately I've been noticing that there's parts of it that I feel have been more of a detriment and a creating a stalemate in progress in
I
creating advocacy.
I think the issue is the way that all of our identities have been politicized.
Yes.
You know, like you can't have an identity without there being some kind of politics associated with it anymore.
Mhm. Yeah.
And because of that politicization of human existence, every identity, every cultural group has started developing its own normative values. They
Mhm.
might all be wildly different from each other, but every cultural minority, every cultural identity has its own values and beliefs of how things should and shouldn't be done.
Mhm.
And that's where we start to have a problem because the world is not cut and dry. No one fits
Mhm.
perfectly into these boxes. So, where you have normative values within a person's identity, you will have people existing at the periphery. And I know Katie Monday and I wrote, in fact, it was yesterday, about the concept of neuroanarchy. So, sort of disconnecting oneself from the hierarchies within your own cultural groups. So, accepting that, you are not a collection of identities, but a single person who belongs to multiple identity groups.
Mhm.
But at the same time, recognizing that you are going to be on the periphery of a lot of those groups. So perhaps it's not necessary to adhere to every normative value of every single group, but instead to construct yourself from the bits that are most relevant.
Yeah. I have noticed this a lot over the past couple of years of my work online, and I'm sure you have as well. As if there's this kind of unspoken set of rules that autistic activists and advocates need to adhere by, certain
Yeah.
beliefs that we all need to share. And it's a rigid kind of very overly, not black and white, but like overly simplified lack of complexity of thought, right? Where I I've seen this a lot in, like, for an example of like, I've seen people get upset with any person who's like who works in ABA, right?
Yeah.
Is that any person who is a part of that is the worst person imaginable, or anybody who has that experience where their kids are in it, they're automatically terrible parents. Whereas it's not really looking at the socioeconomic and intersectional like kind of experiences that might lead that as the only option, right? I know that people of color have a lot of times funding, and the only way their kid can get any help is that they're forced. They don't have an option. They don't have a choice. It has to be done. And they have to be put into that, right? And that by default, then throwing that entire thing under the bus becomes reinforces, white supremacy and privilege. But for me on my page, I have had a lot of people who've gotten really quick to reactionary, like being aggro over a parent who may just be unaware of something, who may be using language that us as a collective and a community may not want to be prescribed to us, that we all can like agree that like, hey, person first language is harmful. but that's the only thing they're focusing on. They're not focusing that that person that might be using that might just not have the experience or the education or knowledge, and they're no longer given the benefit of the doubt. And then that makes them reactionary. It's like, wow, this community is toxic. I don't want anything to do with it. And it becomes this like tone policing and victim blaming kind of back and forth, right? Where it's not
Yeah.
looking at a wider picture and all of these like tiny little pieces that can create a larger whole, where it also reinforces and doesn't look at, for me, I will give people, the benefit of the doubt, and I will give an opportunity for education when possible. My issue is when they no longer take that education and that knowledge that they may have, that wisdom they may have gained, and then they reject it. And that's when it's like, okay, this is now becoming problematic. But I think that like there's this hyper focus on like this identity, that on a lot of things that are so mundane and tiny, that it's distracting us from the larger problem at hand. Is
Yeah.
that any group of people, any sort of issue that exists in our shared reality of the world, is that we often look at the symptom of the problem, not the causation of the problem, and then we identify the
Yeah.
antithesis to the symptom. Whereas like we need to look at what's causing all of these problems on a larger perspective, rather than identifying with that and then becoming the identity of that, and carrying that as like, this is who I am. It's like, no, it's not. That's not who you are. you know
And
it's
I think this is why it's important for the neurodivergent community as a whole to recognize that everything about our existence is constructed by our relationship with the wider environment.
I agree.
So don't get me wrong, I hate ABA.
Yeah,
I do not agree with it.
well,
I think it's abusive and terrible.
hmm
But if a kid is being sent to ABA by their parents, we need to consider, well, what is it in their relationship with the environment that has led to that?
exactly.
You know, how can we create an environment where it's possible for them to step away and remove the child from that situation?
And often
Are we?
ignorance doesn't always equate like a prejudiced kind of intentionalized like harm. It's often people just don't know that ABA is harmful, or they may not
And
know.
this is something I wanted to highlight. It's April. It's Autism
Yeah.
Awareness Month. Um, One thing that becomes clear to me every April is the number of people who are, as Katie Monday put it, what was it? Ignorant, but not in an offensive way. um,
hmm
you know, they it's that Dunning-Kruger thing. You don't know what you don't know.
It's an unknown
Like,
unknown.
you know,
hmm
so lots of people. It seems like everyone should know these things to us because lots of us in this community, being neurodivergent, is a core part of our existence.
hmm
For most people, we exist on the fringes. We are not everyday knowledge. We are not a quantity that
No.
is taught in school.
Most people don't even know what ABA is, or
No,
they
the
don't.
number of people who I've said ABA is bad and they go, "What's ABA?" And I'm
Exactly.
like,
It's like, okay, well then I can't, and if your kid's in it and you don't know what it is, like I can't fault you for that, but here's some education that you may be able to take with you to like kind of question this and see if this is like really the best fit for you or your child. It's I have mentioned this before, and I've noticed some people get pretty upset by it, but autistic people, especially white autistic people, live in an echo chamber. And we've
yeah,
created that echo chamber as a way of us creating solidarity for ourselves, and creating a way of us to protect ourselves in our community and protect others in our community. But there are some real existential threats to autistic people, right? And
yeah,
when we're not giving people an opportunity to grow and be educated on something, we are ignoring that existential threat for something that is just like reactionary. Um, and like you said, like I am very much against ABA. I'm totally against organizations like Autism Speaks, and I will speak at lengths of their evils of the world. But I also like I don't want the neurodiversity movement to become another neoliberal capitalist movement. I don't want it to become this plastic hollow kind of knee jerk, you know, like reactionary in the moment sort of thing. It's like we have very very real problems that are like that have caused us to be othered. And autism speaks in ABA isn't the causation of the problem. They are a symptom of the problem. They are a in itself a reactionary way of trying to fix something that doesn't need to be fixed. But it's not. It's like, where do we go from there? How do we focus on the causation of problem, like addressing that, and it not being just in our little tiny corner of the internet, but like as a granted, I am thankful and I am positive that our movement has grown more into the mainstream. We're now getting better representation. We're now getting, a lot of organizations who are like dropping ABA and like and like like they're not using the same platitudes and logos and symbols for everything. They're now being, you do see like the people are using the puzzle pieces as much as they used to. It's now like using symbols that we have used for ourselves, but it's like that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's putting a new coat of paint on stuff. That doesn't fix the problems that we face. It doesn't create better accommodations for us. It doesn't create less violence for us. It doesn't create less like existential threats for us. It just makes things a little bit prettier. And it's like that's not enough. We need to if we want things to change on a societal level, we need to be able to have the means of like not, I guess, dogpiling as much as we do all the
Yeah,
time. Being a little bit more flexible and a little bit less rigid, which is hard for autistic people. I totally get that. And we have such a firm sense of justice, right? But like we can't let our sense of justice also be our own enemy at the same time.
I
If that
mean,
makes sense.
certainly I've been guilty of all this,
Yes.
especially in the early days, and still,
Yes.
I can think of times recently when, I've had a bad day, seen someone post something I disagree with, and my brain just goes, let them have it.
Fight.
Like, you know, but,
Mhm.
this is why I widely identify myself as what I'd call a neurofuturist. I
Mhm.
believe we need to approach neurodiversity and neurodivergence kind of like it's a field of scientific pioneering almost.
Mhm.
We need to experiment with knowledge production. We need to experiment with new concepts. We can't just keep packaging and repackaging the same few concepts over and over. We can't allow ourselves to be boxed into what is safe and comfortable. We have to look for new things. We are a civil rights movement as much as we are a minority group, and
A science movement.
you know we
Mhm.
we have to embrace the fact that things change over time, and
Mhm.
with it comes new knowledge.
Mhm.
um, I'm very aware we've been going for an hour and a half now, which is definitely the longest podcast episode I've ever done for this podcast.
Mhm.
So I think it's probably a good point to wrap up, unless you had any final thoughts.
Um, Not particularly. I think that's really popping out. Um, do you want to end it, or maybe give the audience a little bit of? Did you want to do like Q&A at all, or do you want to just like end it here?
I would have done Q&A, but it's probably been going on a little while. So I will
Oh,
apologize that we don't have time to do a Q&A with the people watching live.
that's okay.
Um, but
I think this is something that we should continue. In the future, I would love to continue to do future meetings and podcasts with each other.
absolutely, and I certainly look forward to them. But in
Hmm.
the meantime, thank you to everyone who has come and listened. Thank you, Dani, for coming and being an amazing guest.
Oh,
If
thanks.
you have not checked out Dani's page yet, their page is the Punk Rock Autistic. You really should go check it out. It's a fantastic page. And just thank you to everyone who's listened. Thank you to everyone who is listening after the fact when it's on Spotify and everything. Um,
Mhm.
I don't know what the next episode of David's Divergent Discussions is, because in typical neurodivergent fashion, I kind of just do this randomly. Um, and so I can't tell you who the next guest is, but I'm sure it'll be interesting, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, everyone, for coming, and I will catch you all in the next episode. Thank you, Dani. Goodbye.
Mm-hmm.